Hey, Cloudcast community, listen up. Today's show is sponsored by Datadog, a cloud-scale monitoring and analytics platform. Datadog was built to bring clarity to complex dynamic applications, whether they're in the cloud, on-prem, in containers, or wherever you run your applications. With powerful dashboards, seamless integrations, and more than 250 technologies they can monitor, Datadog has you covered. Whether it's AWS, Azure, or Google services, your popular open source projects and products, or web security and APIs, Datadog can help you monitor them and help you collaborate around troubleshooting them and make sure they're running great. Datadog provides deep end-to-end visibility into the health and performance of modern applications. So, try it yourself. Get yourself a free 14-day trial. Go to datadoghq.com/cloudcast. That's datadoghq.com/cloudcast to try out your free 14-day trial. And if you try it out, let them know your friends at Cloudcast sent you, and they'll send you a great, wonderful, soft, awesome t-shirt with the Datadog logo on it. I wear mine all the time. So once again, that's datadoghq.com/cloudcast. Thanks for listening, and here comes the show.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios in the rain-soaked Raleigh, North Carolina. Aaron, it is the year-end spectacular show. How are you doing, man?
Good. Yeah, and not only is it rain-soaked, but I was joking with Brian before we hit record here. The massive studios are so massive, I'm recording this one with a sheet over my head. I don't know if we ever gave away your secrets, but once upon a time you moved your office and there was nothing to pick up to deaden the sound, and it just sounds like all echoey, and I just did the same. And I went to test my audio before we got on this, and I was like, all it is echo. Yeah. So this is what we do for the listeners.
That's right.
I'm basically going to be my own little hot box for the next half hour or so.
Exactly. This is the love that we put in for our audience. So yeah, man, it's our year end sort of wrap up show. This is one that sometimes runs a little long depending on how much we get to talking about stuff. But it's also that sort of week between Christmas and New Year's when people kind of catch up on a bunch of stuff. So you are famous for, doing some sort of thing, you find some new tool. Like, have you done any wonky technical stuff over the break here that people should know about?
Well, anybody who follows me on Twitter knows my joys and rantings of my Roomba that I actually didn't get for Christmas. Kim, my wife, actually got for Christmas. And it's fun because, it kind of goes around the house and does everything for you, and that's great. But mine, for whatever reasons, just seems to beeline under the couch where there's a bunch of extension cords, and it gets all hung up and caught up. And it seems to be missing the kitchen and really wanting to clean under my sofa. But we're fixing that. And the other thing, too, I was just joking, and we need to get Ben on the show. But, we through the serverless community, Ben Keogh. Yes, is really well known because he's kind of chief scientist, if you will, for iRobot, and we actually met him at the serverless conference in Austin a couple of years ago. Yep. And I just was like, I was joking, I'm like, I just kind of say release the Kraken and launch it in the app, and he's like, dude, you got to do it in Alexa. And it turns out if you hook it to Alexa, it's an Easter egg. You can say, Alexa, tell Roomba to release the Kraken. Oop, I just did it. Now mine's going to go off. So there you go.
Nice.
And so anyway, it turns out it was already an Easter egg. So not only was it a bad joke, but it wasn't original either.
Nice. Yeah, I think my two little technical things, I think I unsubscribed from about 100 or so mailing lists. I just got sick of getting a zillion emails from Pottery Barn every day or whatever other thing I accidentally signed up for. So that's been good. And I installed a after factory backup camera on my truck, which meant I had to take apart the back tail lights and clamp a bunch of wires together and tie things together. And so that was sort of a fun adventure. Only dropped a few F-bombs and not having all the right tools.
Well, so I have to figure that one out too. So I have a 16-year-old daughter, and she's driving, and so watch out, everyone. First of all, but she's been asking for a backup camera. But then I kind of was in that mode of that if it's an aftermarket one, and I don't honestly, she's a good driver.
Yeah.
But do I trust her even with the backup camera? Because here I'm going to pay this money for the backup camera, and she's probably still going to back up into something.
Right.
And then does she smash the camera, and then I'm doubly mad because she backed into something and smashed the camera? I don't know. I'm trying to figure that one.
Yeah, we'll talk about that one. That way, the one I got so far has been good. We'll put it in the show notes for anybody who wants it. I did a little research, so once it got installed, it's worked out good, and I would probably recommend it to folks. It's a good sort of price point versus hassle of installing. So. Well, cool, man. Listen, the end of year show, we always do a little bit of housekeeping, kind of, for people that have listened to the show for a very long time. They both know us. For people that are new to the show, which surprisingly this year, and again last year and this year, it's been up about 20% or so. So I think there's probably a lot of people who don't necessarily even know who we are. So this is Brian Gracely. Over to my left, that's Aaron Delp. We used to do the show a lot together. Life got interesting, work got interesting. We don't always do the shows together. So if you're wondering, why both names are on the show, that's why. We do them when we can, where we can, as we can.
And it'd be interesting to see from a stats standpoint, because we don't actually track this one. Maybe we need to start how many shows we've actually done together.
Yeah. It would be like the reverse of a hockey stick curve. It would be, used to be a lot. Now is not very many. Although I know for sure, you win sort of favorite guest host of the year, every year. Cause every show you do ends up being the highest ranked, most listens of the year. So the fans most definitely like you best. You have to be on a few more times next year.
That's pretty funny actually,
which is okay. So, a couple of basic things people always are curious. The show was up about 18-19% this year. So thank you to everybody who listens and tells a friend and, giving us feedback and all that sort of stuff. And the fact that it keeps growing is awesome. Thank you to both A Cloud Guru and Datadog, who have been sponsors both previously and currently on the show. So it's always awesome to have sponsors on the show. And then we are at about 47 or 48% of our Krispy Kreme number. So for folks that don't know that's the donut run. That's the Krispy Kreme fundraiser challenge that we do for the North Carolina Children's Hospital. People make donations, and Aaron and I do the dumb thing of running and eating donuts. So yeah, we're about $2,200 as of today, as out of about a $3,500 goal. So thank you to everybody who makes donations.
Yeah, and real quick on that too. So. For those that maybe are new this year, so I think this year we're going to cross $30,000.
Yep, we should.
If we're fortunate this year, and so hopefully $30,000 over the last 8 years or so. Again, all the money goes to North Carolina Children's Hospital. Go to the websites in the top right corner. Just click on that. We don't ask necessarily for anything from the listeners other than, once a year we ask them to support this charity for us. And in exchange for that, again, the race is run 2.5 miles, eat a dozen donuts, run 2.5 miles back, keep it all down. And if you do it in under an hour, I'm using air quotes here, win.
That's right.
And we've managed to, we've run it every year. Some years we get all the donuts down. Some years we don't make it in an hour. I think we've actually won, maybe twice. I think I've won. And again, air quotes on won. Yep. So, and it's then you go home and you sleep for the afternoon because you're in a sugar coma.
That's right. So again, thanks for folks. If you're curious about donating, again, 100% tax free, 100% of the dollars go to the NC Children's Hospital. If you go to the cloudcast.net, which is the website, there's a big logo up in the top right corner, or if you go to our Twitter page, in the bio for the Twitter page, it's in the URL. So if you want to donate, we would greatly appreciate it, and the kids would greatly appreciate it as well. So, man, we don't do a lot of predictions anymore. I think we used to do more prediction shows at the end of the year, but we are, for some odd reason, we are pretty good at picking companies that either get a lot of funding or get acquired. We should have started a hedge fund or an M&A fund a long time ago.
Yes.
We actually, I think this year went over the $50 billion mark so these are companies that have come on the show, and since they've been on our show, we've either gotten M&A funding or been acquired over the last, 8 years or something like that. We went over $50 billion. Part of that is a little askewed this year because Microsoft acquired GitHub for a little over $7 billion, and IBM acquired Red Hat for almost $34 billion. So a lot of that is up this year. So, and by the way, did you hear that IBM acquired Red Hat?
Yeah, I heard that. So can I tell everyone my story about that real quick?
Are you going to, I think first of all, you need to apologize for the listeners because for years you've been saying that Cisco was going to acquire Red Hat.
That's
and
true.
If they were expecting good information from us.
Yes, I was wrong on that one without a doubt. So it turns out the day that happened, actually. So again, we don't maybe talk as much about our personal lives as much since we're not on the podcast together as much, but I was actually running my first full marathon this year is the Marine Corps Marathon in Washington, D.C. back in October. And I'm running this marathon and I turn off all the alerts on, my phone, my watch, everything. So I'm just running, I'm just doing my thing. And then I did well. At least I feel like I did well. I mean, you
finished. That was good.
I finished, but it is a long run. And it's, by the end of it, you're getting tired and you're starting to hurt and, it is what it is. Right. And I get to the finish line. I'm at the Marines Monument in Washington, D.C. I got my finisher medal and I'm checking all my texts and, Twitter and all this other stuff. And I get this one from you and then from multiple other people. Everyone was like, did you see what happened to Red Hat? And I'm like, no, I've been busy. So then I immediately had to go figure out what the heck happened to Red Hat.
Yep.
So that's how I know exactly what day it was that they were born.
Yep. But so and unfortunately, I cannot talk about it in any way, shape, or form because the deal is not closed. And for those that don't know, I work, my day job is at Red Hat, so I can't talk about it. But you're welcome to speculate and talk about it all you want, man.
And I will just say it's a bummer Cisco didn't buy him because they would have been fun to be right on that one. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say. Yeah. And I will say this: if only we could have gotten a small percentage of that $50 billion. I know that's been on the podcast over the years.
I know. So
we're way undercharging.
So if any of our VC friends out there want, some advisory services, we are happy to provide, those types of things. But no, I look at the companies that got acquired: Red Hat, Rightscale, CoreOS, GitHub, Evident.io, Loggly, CloudHealth, VictorOps, and Bonsai. All companies that had been on the Cloudcast in the past got acquired this year. Pivotal went IPO this year. And then in terms of funding, so companies to keep an eye on going forward, SWIM.AI, Stryth, Leviathan, Atomist, Kasten, Lightstep, Rubrik, Hashicorp got another big round of funding at $1 billion valuation, and then our friends at A Cloud Guru. So another big year for funding, for VC funding, and we're lucky to talk to a lot of those folks kind of in their early stages.
Yep, absolutely. So where do we want to go from here? What do you want to talk about next? We're kind of all over as we tend to do with our end of year shows. What do we want to talk about next?
Yeah, maybe we just talk about some of the big trends that kind of emerged this year. I think one of the big ones, and we've talked about sort of public cloud and where it's gone for a long time. I think this was the year that public cloud really, began to, I don't want to say got really big, but the companies who have been investing in it really heavily, the multi-billion-dollar quarter investments, the companies that we think of as the big, however many, really kind of pulled away from the pack. And I think we saw that. Gartner, who does their Magic Quadrant every year that everybody kind of used to look at, and Amazon has been at the top of for a year. They narrowed down their list. It used to be like 15, 18 companies. It's now just 6 companies that are considered large, major public clouds in terms of sort of IaaS, but sort of the foundational thing. And it's AWS, Azure, Google, Alibaba, IBM, and Oracle. So it's down to 6 that they consider big enough to be really worth their time in evaluating.
Yeah, and it really comes down to, we kind of all, I don't think this is a shock to anyone, right? But it also comes down to the basic financials over the years that everyone's always thought of, to play in this space, you have to be in the billions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's just not a lot of companies that can even think about doing that. It goes way back, I'm going to completely date myself here, but way back when you and I were like, middle school, high school, college, you used to dial up your local internet service provider.
Yep.
And then they all, and then you had the big infrastructures, and then America Online and all these others came over. You had this, big, over time, all the little ones went away and you only had a couple big ones because the finances it takes to play at that level there just aren't a lot of players left. And that's what we had here. We had a complete maturation of this market.
Right. Yeah. And I think we're seeing now, the numbers are still a little bit fuzzy. AWS gets broken out pretty cleanly by Amazon. They're roughly a $25 billion a year business, which is crazy. Azure is roughly, and again, Azure is not nearly as cleanly broken out by Microsoft, but they're in that $25 to $28 billion a year range. Google, I think, is now a pretty distant third. They're still not broken out at all, which lends me to think they're less than $1 billion a quarter, but I don't know that for sure. That's just a speculation based on how other companies report. But, there's definitely, we're definitely seeing the trend that always seems to happen in technology, which is a lot of consolidation around, the biggest names. Some of the smaller ones fall off, especially the ones that can't compete because of scale. And then, it's going to be really interesting to watch if, any sort of new innovation comes along from somebody, a DigitalOcean or an Alibaba or somebody else that kind of disrupts right now what is kind of a two-horse race in terms of kind of the foundation of public cloud. Right now, and we'll talk about Google and kind of what's going on with Google a little bit later in the show. But I think that's one of the biggest trends that we're seeing is just kind of how big and fast that some of the ones are really growing.
No, agreed. And the other thing I would add to that too was, you weren't there for the AWS keynotes this year, but I'm assuming you caught them on the streams or after the fact.
Yep.
But we've always been kind of watched those whether in person or remote, and it was super interesting to me this year. Like just take the AWS keynotes for instance, how not just how clear all of that was, but how much they were trying to distance themselves from everyone else, but at the same time trying to be super forward-looking. They were trying to be both boring infrastructure and, hey, we do AI and ML and satellites and all this other stuff.
Right.
And it's like, it was a little bit of like this dual personality thing that happened. And is that something that all of them are going to have to do going forward? Do you have to be boring infrastructure and have the basic services for the, the enterprise and the play it safe people that all they care about is where am I storing stuff and what database am I using? Or do you want the super, super forward-looking, AI machine learning cloud?
Yeah, I think you're going to need to. I think people always have to remember, like the stuff that seems super interesting and gets a lot of the whatever con presentations and so forth isn't making a lot of money. Our good friends like Matt Ellis over at Cloudability, they put out a really good state of the cloud report that I'll publish in the show notes. I think we've talked about it before, but they basically call out because they have a really good insight into how people are using the platform because they do cost management. But still 75-80% of most of AWS revenues is still EC2 and EBS and S3 and RDS and the database service. So, your most basic services of, network, compute, storage, and database are still the things that are making the most money. And there's a really good then breakdown of what the next 8 or 9 or 10 things are. But so, I think you've got to be really good at boring. I think there's a whole kind of thing that happens where you're then trying to take cost out of boring and become more profitable at boring. I think what we're seeing in the AWS world, and we'll probably see this evolve in some of the other ones as well, is they're trying to make those quote unquote foundational boring services like less human impactful, right? So it'll be you don't have to manage your servers anymore. You don't have to manage your nodes anymore. They just kind of auto scale for you. They auto update the OS for you. And like we're seeing that, we've already seen that on the database side. We'll see that in other things as well. And that'll be the boring side of things. And then the new stuff will always sort of surprise us. I mean, the one stat that jumped out at me that was kind of the most surprising this year, and maybe I should have looked at it in the past, but like at one point I looked in the fall, AWS had 6,600 open job recs. 6,600 open job recs. You think about like how many any of the other really big IT vendors have at any given time. Like I think Azure had 2,200 and Google Cloud had like 180 at the time. And you think about, maybe a Cisco or whatever, they might have a few hundred in any given cycle. So there's a different game being played in terms of forward-lookingness and where they want to be.
Yeah, completely agree. And you look at too another stat was the amount of services. At this point, AWS is 150 plus services. maybe even 200 at this point, because they announced so many services at reInvent. So it is just amazing to me as well. Like, it has gone from not just can somebody be an expert in AWS, you can't even do that anymore. And so now you can't even be a public cloud expert. You have to be a public cloud, sub area expert. Like, I'm the infrastructure expert, or I'm the voice expert, or, all of these other things as well.
Yeah, I think to your point about the number of services and what I actually saw a few people make some comments maybe the day after the keynote, or a couple of days after the keynote, and they had logged back into their AWS account, and stuff like the managed satellite service and the managed Bitcoin service, and people were like, "Hey, can you take what's the new service that I can start taking these services I don't use out of my console, because I just don't have enough space for them anymore." And so you start to run into second and third order sort of problems when you get that.
Well, and so it's funny you mentioned that, because I was on I was meeting with some folks, and I was asked to give actually some predictions before the keynotes, and one of the predictions I actually gave was almost like the simple dashboard. Yeah. Right. Because everyone knew they were going to announce more stuff. But at what point do you announce here's the AWS dashboard for dummies. Here's the 20 or 30 services people use the most. Yeah. Or here's the 20 or 30 your account uses.
Right. What's the menu that they have at McDonald's now? I just want number one, and it includes the three things that everybody uses. So, yeah. So I think public cloud, I think again is probably the biggest trend we're seeing in terms of growth and that sort of thing. The second one that sort of jumped out at me, and I think we talked a little about the IBM acquisition of Red Hat, but big open source acquisitions or things tied to open source, were probably the second biggest, trend or newsmaker. You had obviously IBM buying Red Hat, $34 billion. You had Hortonworks and Cloudera merging. So the two sort of big data open source companies, kind of got together. Both of them had sort of been public. I think they were both public, but they basically said like, hey, we need to consolidate that industry. You had Microsoft buying GitHub, which, has sort of become the de facto place that people are writing code. People are still trying to figure out the open source business model, but man, it made for a lot of acquisition dollars this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's really interesting to me to see what's next here, because I really feel like, all of the big players kind of got gobbled up this year. So, what is the next wave? And who are the next set of big players? One thing we found over the years with this podcast is all of these industries are very cyclical. Of you have all this emerging tech, and we kind of talk about and cover these emerging techs, and then eventually it keeps getting bigger and keeps getting bigger, and then eventually there's some kind of consolidation. There's some losers that just never get funding and go off. There's some that get bought at a fire sale, and there's some that do well. What we really saw this year was a lot of the big open source companies all get pulled off the market. So what's next?
Right.
I'm asking that very, honestly, I don't know.
I think it, I think open source, I think, is going through, they're going through some, I want to call it midlife crises, but I think they're going through some midlife learning in terms of, okay, the first 20-something years were very Linux-centric. We've seen this huge explosion of things that were infrastructure-centric, but we've also seen databases and big data. I mean, I think the things you take away from it is, open source has really become sort of the de facto place for innovation in the industry, right? We're seeing VCs invest in it. We're seeing companies buy it. So that's sort of becoming a default. But beyond that, I think, the next big challenge becomes, how do you keep these big communities going and be able to monetize them in a way that the innovation keeps happening, but the people that are putting the time and effort into it are somehow getting rewarded financially for it or compensated for it. And the other side of that is, and we're starting to see the beginning of this, and I don't know if this will be a big trend or if this is just another thing, is we saw a couple of companies, both Redis and Confluent. So Redis, well known for the Redis database, or Redis Labs for the Redis database, and Confluent, who does Apache Kafka. Both basically came out and said, hey, look, one, our technology is super popular, and two, our biggest problem right now is the public cloud providers taking our code, turning it into a managed service, and not paying us a dime. and not contributing any code back. And so they literally went out and changed their licensing model from, the very, very open kind of standard open source licensing models to these new models. And they're basically saying you're welcome to do all the things that you've always done with open source, unless you're a public cloud provider. And then if you just take our code and just try and sell it as, a managed service without contributing back, you can't do that anymore. And, they've gotten some blowback from the industry and, some supporters in the industry, but I think it is, the open source community sort of saying, like, how do we work in the world where, the like AWS, for example, likes to claim they do a lot of open source stuff, and Adrian Cockcroft would tell us they do a lot of stuff, but in reality, they sort of contribute where it only makes sense for them, and it's kind of not working very well with the broader open source community, and what it means, we'll see. But that's a really kind of an interesting early set of data points to start watching for people.
Yeah, I mean, it really is the intersection of the two biggest trends, not just from this year, but from since we've been doing this podcast. What happens when public cloud and open source collide?
Yep.
And I don't know that anyone saw this coming, way back when. In the the 70s, 80s, when a lot of this, the stuff was necessarily starting to be just an idea, right? And it's this natural evolution of these markets, and now you're starting to see this intersection and crossover, and everyone is going to have to figure out how they all live together long term.
Yep. So you sort of live in the HCI space, the CI space. It's funny, 8 years ago we started this show as sort of a converged infrastructure show. We're now seeing the HCI market, which is kind of the second generation of that, explode. Like, what's going on in that space? A lot of record funding for a lot of companies. We're seeing some consolidation, but we're seeing new companies get involved. Like, what's going on in the HCI space from an infrastructure perspective?
Well, so it's super interesting in that, just like anything else, it is a standard of, hey, everything was there, everything was priced at a premium, everything was best of breed, and then you kind of get this eventual race to commodity. I don't want to say race to the bottom. I'm going to say race to commodity, to where things aren't nearly as differentiated as much. The concept of hardware differentiation or differentiation in ASICs doesn't exist anymore. And even the idea of hardware differentiation really doesn't exist anymore. Everything is software defined. Everything is, runs on industry standard hardware at this point. Everything is, at the end of the day, it is maybe almost an intersection of open source at many times, as well as infrastructure. And what you're really seeing now is this removal of friction from infrastructure operations on-prem. And it doesn't matter if it's running the apps, whether it's older virtualization workloads, if it's newer cloud native workloads, if it's, backup and recovery and data protection. You're seeing this, top to bottom in a standard infrastructure stack in a data center. You're just seeing, top to bottom hardware commoditization, which leads to, differentiation on the software side.
Yep.
And it's a really interesting trend, and it's really interesting space to be in right now, because, like, for instance, way back when we started this podcast, we both were in some way, shape, or form involved in converged infrastructure space. For all intents and purposes, I won't say that market is dead, but I will say that market is on the decline.
Yep.
I don't think anyone, can dispute that one. And it has been displaced by HCI. HCI is the up and coming thing. And why? Because again, it's that removal of friction.
Right.
From everyone wants to go faster and be cheaper.
Right.
Yeah. And that's what the consumers want.
Yep. Yeah. They want it simpler. They want it, easier to buy. The other thing that's sort of interesting to me is I think even the HCI space, there was a bunch of innovation in that space. You had, a bunch of companies that were trying to figure stuff out, the Nutanix of the world, and Dell and VMware and Rubrik and, Cohesity and others and so forth. And now you're starting to see sort of the second generation of what those companies have to do. And you're seeing them go, oh, we're going to build our own hypervisor, or we're going to build our own Kubernetes stack, or we're going to do, a partnership with Azure or AWS. So it's like, it's not just about the commoditization of hardware, but it's like, oh, now we have to figure out how to be, software. Where do we provide software value? Do I want that tied to the hardware? Do I not want that tied to the hardware? So I think we're seeing kind of the next generation of the decisions the HCI vendors have to make, but then also, the more complicated thing, which is like, am I selling to infrastructure people and then how much software do they want? Or am I selling to sort of app DevOps teams and how much software do they want embedded? And those are always, once you get into blurred lines, then it becomes more interesting of like, okay, when do I buy this and which team buys this and who holds the budget for that and who's the decision makers? And so I think the HCI space probably still is going to have a second generation of trying to figure out winners and losers and best architectures and all that stuff.
Yeah. And really, I think that winners and losers is going to be defined by a combination of how do you provide value? There's so many different ways you can provide value. And it is almost a little bit like folks trying to figure out the profitable open source model once upon a time.
Yep.
Where, let's be honest, Nutanix is the big one out there right now. And Nutanix was the big winner. Well, can people copy Nutanix? And even Nutanix, they very much shifted. It used to be a hardware model. Now it's a software model. Now it's their own hypervisor model. Now it's their own management model. Many would say it's a little bit of like the VMware playbook all over again,
right?
Of get the hypervisor, then get the management plane. Maybe, right? And how much room is there in the market for that kind of play all over again? And so I don't even think the model of how the profit is going to be taken out of that industry is defined yet.
No. I think, like I said, like you said, the first round winner tended to be Nutanix. A lot of people tried to sort of chase after that and catch up, and some have done well and some have struggled. And but yeah, now that the sort of hardware profits are working their way out of it, it becomes the how do you drive software profits, and that's the challenge that everybody in the industry is trying to deal with right now. Let's talk about real quick. We'll talk about kind of the next little layer up in the stack, and then I want to kind of shift gears a little bit. The next layer in the stack tends to be sort of virtualization containers. In the container world, it's basically Kubernetes. It's been 2.5 years now, and Kubernetes has sort of won that space.
I have to say this real quick too. It's been fun to watch you very politically toe the line over the years on the podcast of you didn't want to claim them the winner.
Yeah.
But it was pretty clear a long time ago. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
You didn't want to say it, but it was.
Yeah. Well, I think
I think we can safely say at this point.
Well, and I think the reason is because it's still such a small, like, I didn't want to claim it to be a winner for 2 reasons. Well, 3 reasons. One, because I work in it, I didn't want to jinx it. But two, I think it's still a small amount of money, right? And I think, we have to be realistic of like, yes, what's a hot trend versus are people really spending a lot of money on that? And, virtualization still, people spend a lot more money on virtualization than they do containers. But yeah, I mean, roughly 8,000 people or so at KubeCon this year, up from 4,500 last year and 1,000 the year before. I think Kubernetes has kind of won the Kubernetes technology or the container technology space. It was interesting. Docker had a very, very small booth, which was very weird. I mean, if you think back 2 years ago, all we were talking about is Docker. Docker is, I don't want to say they've become sort of an also ran in the market, but I mean, just the brand of Docker has been completely overwhelmed by Kubernetes in this space. And now there are dozens of companies competing for Kubernetes and stuff. So yeah, that's been an interesting thing to watch. And we'll see if it's able to sort of break through, kind of cross the chasm in terms of mass market adoption versus, kind of the early niche of, people that are like, I need containers for, automation and scale and all that other stuff.
Yeah, agreed.
Let's shift gears just a little bit because we've been talking a lot about kind of what's been happening in tech. Let's talk about the dollars and cents a little bit. What's been going on in the market as it relates to technology in the last year?
Well, so I'll be honest with you. The biggest one that I thought was really interesting lately in the public cloud space was and you almost had to wait for the other shoe to drop, and it recently did, of Thomas Kurian leaving Oracle and going over to Google Cloud, Diane Green out at Google Cloud. And then the other shoe being then Ellison kind of poo-pooing Oracle Cloud somewhat, which it never really got retracted, but Oracle Cloud is still trying to, go really big, and good friend of the show, Leo Leong, is over there and is, beating the drum as hard as he can. And I think Oracle Cloud, it seemed interesting and still does seem interesting because they have such a huge install base. Like all they have to do is start converting that install base. They don't even have to go after net new customers, right? Like I always think of things like that, like that's just interesting economically. Yeah. But the combination of Thomas leaving and then Larry Ellison almost like, I won't say putting a nail in the coffin because I don't think that at all. But I do think like he very firmly signaled, I don't know what's up with Oracle Cloud going forward. Yeah. And the flip side of that is like Thomas Kurian running Google Cloud. That may be a pretty good thing, hopefully.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot to unpack in both of those. I think Oracle is the interesting thing with Oracle, and we don't talk about it as much, and we've got some things in the show notes that kind of get into us. Oracle Cloud does relatively well on the SaaS side of things. They've kind of done what Oracle does, which is we're going to buy some of the, the SaaS, the best SaaS applications that people use that are in our, business application space. And they've done relatively well in CRM and ERP and some other stuff, HR apps. And they don't talk about that so much. They're so engrossed with trying to keep up with Amazon and so forth that, I think they've sort of forgotten that they're pretty good at the SaaS part of that. We talked a little bit about Kurian going to Google and the challenges of the Google culture and him coming from the Oracle culture. Yeah, that's going to be a big story for 2019. Can he figure out how to turn Google into a company that Google Cloud into a company that can sell to the enterprise, right? I mean, that's it. Like that's your scorecard for 2019. Did you do better at that? Do enterprises trust Google Cloud, or do they exit 2019 saying like, yeah, I treat Google Cloud the same way I treat Google Reader. I'm just not sure if they're going to be, successful, and they want me to do that stuff. So it was an interesting thing in the market. I mean, the market as a whole, we look at the markets, we're down about 12%. So that's the S&P, the Dow Jones, and not great for everybody's 401ks and so forth. Tech across the board was kind of mixed. Last year we talked about tech was way up. We had companies that were up 100% and 80% and all sorts of things. I think VMware was up 13%. Salesforce was up 18%. Red Hat was up, but those numbers are a little bit inflated because of the IBM acquisition. But I mean, and Amazon was up 12%, but Apple was down, Microsoft 11%. But I think the big takeaway for me is the really big companies, the ones that have been bellwethers forever. So the Oracles, the IBMs, the SAPs, and so forth. They basically tracked the market. They were down. And I think we're going to have to sort of think about a new set of who are the really big companies. And we put some stuff in the show notes about SaaS companies. Some people have done some really nice things with SaaS companies and looking at the Workdays and Twilios and, Atlassians and those companies. And I think we need to maybe spend some more time digging into those companies because those are becoming the new kind of blue chip, standard of technology that are, at the application level, especially the packaged application level that the IBMs and SAP and Oracles used to be of the world.
Well, and there's always the one we've never had anybody on the show, not even in the ecosystem, and that's Salesforce.
Right. And Salesforce continues to do. They bought MuleSoft, which is a $5 billion acquisition.
I was thinking about that the other day. I'm like, I saw it was yet another really good article on Salesforce and how well they're doing, and I was like, that's always been kind of a blind spot for us. And that's just maybe our backgrounds coming out and them never really being an infrastructure company at all. They just never been on our radar and we've never been in those circles. But yeah, to your point, like it is going to be the who are the next big ones. We've said this before on the podcast, like, okay, who is the next Oracle, HP, IBM, Dell, EMC, these big infrastructure companies that are multi-billion-dollar companies. And yeah, at this point, it's looking like it is going to be AWS, it is going to be Salesforce, it is going to be a different set of companies. And it's that typical, like, hey, when we were kids, like it was Xerox and it was like some of these other companies were considered the high tech companies at the time. And you always have this natural turnover generationally. And that's just what happens. And we are right now in the very midst of that who is the next ones.
Yeah. And I think the thing that's going to be interesting to watch, and this is what makes it a little bit trickier is, in the past, the industry was so siloed, like Cisco for networking and Oracle for databases and EMC for storage and, Microsoft for OS or Red Hat or something like that. I think we're going to see very blurred companies, right? So, like take Salesforce, CRM company, but then they're buying, they bought, is it Mooksoft? Not Mooksoft. They bought MuleSoft, to get into the application integration space. And they made a big investment in Docker here recently to sort of get in the infrastructure space. So it's like, that's a blurred lined company, right? Like they're in everywhere, right? They're a portfolio company. You take somebody like GitHub, who just got acquired by Microsoft, but then just made a huge announcement, as well as GitLabs, sort of the CI/CD code companies. And they're like, hey, we're now offering basically serverless functions that you can, integrate right on our platform with your code. And it's like, boy, that takes a lot of the middlemen out of a lot of infrastructure things for what's going on there. So
yeah, completely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I think the other thing from a where the market went perspective, between Bitcoin and blockchain, boy, I feel like everybody and their brother got out of Bitcoin because the market just collapsed. Now, I don't know if that means it'll come back because I don't follow it. And there were more articles written in the last quarter about, hey, blockchain, it doesn't solve any problems. Like, what problems does it solve? It doesn't solve any problems. They keep saying it's going to solve problems. Like, between the two of those, they need a new PR agency. They need something, because right now the market basically just completely gave up on Bitcoin and blockchain. Like, simultaneously, overnight, everything just crapped the bed.
Well, no, agree. First of all, agree completely. But I'm going to actually, you probably know more about it, so I'm going to open-ended question and let you answer it too. I almost feel like they're a little bit like software-defined networking was, at least for the masses. I felt like we heard about it, and we talked about it, and it was on all the podcasts, and we talked to a bunch of folks about it. And then honestly, at the end of the day, not only did I never see a lot of mainstream adoption of it, I never even saw like a bunch of funding rounds and the usual, things we see of funding rounds and exits and all of that. It all just kind of just went away.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, I know it's being used and I know people are out there using it, but I feel like it's niche-y. I know you followed that market more closely. So what's your thoughts on it? Because I completely agree. Like, blockchain almost seems like a solution looking for a problem to solve.
I've tried to pay attention to it because I'm like, okay, forget about the Bitcoin piece of it. Let's look at and every time I follow people that are really smart about it, they're coming back around to going, maybe I can just do this with a database. Maybe I can just do this with a database. Maybe I don't need something that's as distributed. And I'm sure there are some applications that are used. I know there's some food tracking things that are being used. And but I think the speculation that there is going to be this sort of universal, non-centrally controlled, thing. I think the combination of both the politics and the organization of doing something like that, which, maybe the internet is a good example of it or whatever, and just the technology use cases, they're just not in alignment. And this just may very well be one of these things where it's like, it was 10 years ahead of its time and it needs a whole nother level of, computation to be cheaper, or people to just, trust distributed systems more or something. But this felt like the year that people just said, nope, not buying into it, not believing it. And, we go back to the drawing board and again, we've talked to some people that do like AI and ML and so forth. And they're like, yeah, there was a AI and ML winter, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when everybody gave up on the technology, and now those things are becoming more mainstream, AI and ML, and people kind of trust them. And, they feel like the technology works. So it may just be as simple as that, or it may just be, it wasn't a thing, it happens. So.
Exactly. In the startup world, there's always the concept of product fit, right?
Yep.
Sometimes you'll have an idea and you'll go through the initial funding round, and the whole idea behind an angel round or a seed round and A round is go find product fit. And you certainly want it by B round. If you don't have good product fit by B round, you're done.
Yep.
And it almost feels like that. We just never got product fit in the category.
Yeah, and if you're a blockchain guru or know of somebody, please bring them on the show. We'd love to get educated, but right now we're kind of going, take it off our list of things to focus on. So the other thing I think that'll be worth watching for people in 2019 is, we've already, this is an economic thing. We've already seen a couple of small interest rate bumps, at least here in the United States. Obviously, the U.S. economy affects a lot of things. The Fed is already projecting 2, maybe 3 more rate hikes. I can't remember how many that is. And those are usually like a quarter of a point each. So, you start getting into 4 or 5 rate hikes. That's, 1.5, almost 2 points of interest rate hikes. That messes up all sorts of VC calculations and so forth. So, when those things start happening is when we start seeing very different, very rapidly changing out of VC worlds and, funding rounds and not funding rounds, and companies that you thought, they weren't acquirable now become, available and so forth. So always a macro level thing for people to keep in the back of their mind as to what might influence the markets and acquisitions and other things like that.
Yeah. And I really think what will happen is we really did go through kind of a heyday of infrastructure funding or just VC funding in general. But you're going to start to see smaller funding and quicker exits.
Yep. Yeah, you have to.
You're not going to see this, hundreds of millions of dollars and build up the $1 billion unicorns and take 5 to 7 years to get to exit. You're going to see more of, tens of millions of dollars in funding and hundreds of $1 million in exits, and on a much quicker timeline.
Yeah. Well, and I think that becomes the byproduct of, there aren't going to be a lot of companies that try and start a hardware business, right? I mean, we're sort of end of that cycle of trying to start a hardware business. So, if things are software, the cycles can go much faster. Like you said, you figure out product fit much quicker. Enterprise companies will take a little bit longer, but especially if the interest rates and money gets tighter or money gets, just different, then things change. Hey, yep. So I think we're kind of getting towards the end. Any last minute areas that were really interesting to you or focus areas that you expect to be looking at for 2019?
Yeah. So the one that's super interesting to me, and actually goes back to, I was at reInvent this year, and reInvent, and that's a whole other show in itself of how crazy it was. But whenever I wasn't doing the day job, my actual focus actually this year was on the voice first Alexa kind of space, right? I actually went to a couple of the sessions. I watched a couple of the sessions on replay, and it is amazing to me to see how serious they are in that space compared to the others that are out there, and just the voice first and all the Alexa stuff going on, and Google Home and Cortana and Siri and all these others, right? But I find it a super, super fascinating space, and it's a super fascinating space where you're starting to see monetization of it. You're starting to see small companies forming. We haven't reached the point of VC funding in it, but I actually think that that's probably one of the next steps.
Yeah.
So for me, the voice area is super interesting. But
yeah, I think a couple of things. I think it's going to be interesting to watch. We always continue to watch the companies that build standalone technologies that can be run anywhere, sort of the multi-cloud type of thing, versus, like you said, the breadth of native services that end up on one of the public clouds. So in Azure and AWS or Google or whatever, it's going to be very interesting to see how much customers, want to use the native services, which tend to be sometimes a little more expensive, because somebody else manages it for you, or less feature rich, but they're native, right? They're just sort of built into your, you can get them just natively built, or, how much they continue to be like, hey, I want to be multi-cloud. I don't want to be tied to a single cloud. I want to use software that I can, run on any cloud environment. Like, I think that's going to be a big trend to sort of watch in terms of, companies that succeed and companies that struggle, and does this create new partnership models between, software companies in the public cloud and so forth. I think that's going to be very interesting. And then I think for me, continuing to figure out, what is AI and ML possible? What are they capable of doing? How does that get embedded in the things we do day to day? How does that get embedded in technology? Those are very, very interesting to me in terms of, things that beyond just the day to day stuff that we do.
Agreed. And one last one, I'm just going to mention it. I won't even really talk too much about it, but not IoT per se, but the infrastructure that runs IoT. So the kind of the guts and the back ends to all of that, because it requires a completely different set of technologies to run all of that. And me just kind of, it scratches the infrastructure itch for me.
Yeah.
So that's definitely an area I want to look into more this year as well.
Yep. So just a little bit of housekeeping to finish up the show. As always, folks, we mentioned at the beginning, if you get a chance to make a donation to help the kids at NC Children's Hospital, top of the cloudcast.net homepage or off our Twitter page bio, you can get to that. What you're going to see from us for the first basically month of this year or first few shows for this year, we're not doing predictions, but we're going to go out and reach out to some folks that cover some very specific spaces: DevOps, serverless, cloud native apps, infrastructure, AI, ML, and we're going to sit down with those folks and just be like, what do you think the world's going to look like in 2019, and hit on those topics. So expect to see those shows very soon at the early part of 2019, and then we will kind of get back to the normal, interesting founders, interesting technology interviews, and a bunch of other things that we kind of have in mind. So, folks, we can't thank you enough for listening to the show week after week. We love putting it out for you, but you continue to come back, you continue to tell a friend, the show continues to grow. We can't thank you enough for listening, first and foremost, giving us some of your time and learning with us, but telling a friend, giving us feedback, trying to make the show better. And we hope we can keep doing that for you in 2019. And Aaron, any last thoughts?
No, I think you really covered them all. Again, the only thing I can say is, again, thank you to everyone. It has been an amazing run. It is coming up on 8 years almost of the podcast. And so it has been fun to keep learning and keep growing with everyone that's out there. And again, keep those suggestions coming in. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So for Aaron and myself, folks, thanks as always for listening this week. And we will talk to you both next week and next year.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.